Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar titled Beyond Default, Succeeding at Corporate Transformation, brought to you by Lid Publishing and Formicio. As I said, my name is Marian Bernstein, and I'm the Communications Manager for Lid Publishing here in New York City, and I will be your moderator today. It's with great pleasure to introduce our two presenters who are authors and strategic management consultants, David Trafford and Peter Boggis. A bit more on each. David Trafford is an experienced consultant, mentor, and executive who over the past 30 years has developed the skills and insights needed to help individuals, teams, and boards deliver successful change, specifically technology-enabled transformation. Increasingly, his focus has been on organizations that either aim to create a truly digital business or to make their existing business more digitally enabled. And of course, we also have Peter Boggis, who has over 20 years of helping major corporations transform their business and IT operating models for increased business value. In particular, he specializes in helping clients to build innovation, collaboration, and portfolio management capabilities as a source of increased organizational strength. And as some of you know, David and Peter co-authored the book Beyond Default, Setting Your Organization on a Trajectory to an Improved Future, and that was published by Lid Publishing. In his foreword, business strategist and blockchain revolution author Don Tapscott says, quote, "This management book provides the tools to take strategy level," end quote. And if you missed the recent episode of John Oliver, I highly recommend it. Don Tapscott actually makes a brief appearance. All right, so moving right along here, just to give you a better understanding of what David and Peter will discuss during today's webinar. First, they will address the purpose of corporate transformation. Next, they'll discuss why corporate transformation is a challenge for many organizations. And finally, they'll discuss what leaders can do to increase the chances of success. And please keep in mind that after David and Peter present today, you will all have the opportunity to type your specific questions for them into the chat box on the screen. After this Q&A session, we'll be choosing one very lucky registrant at random who will then receive a free hard copy of their book Beyond Default. So it'll definitely be worth your while to stick around until the end of the webinar here. All right, so with that, I will now pass the mic over to Peter Boggis, who will kick us off.
Thanks, Marian. So good morning or good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for joining us. One of the things that David and I really wanted to address in the research and the preparation of this book was to understand how successful or otherwise companies and organizations were at transforming themselves. And in the research for the book, we found what we would broadly call three categories of organizations. So the first category that we'll talk about will be familiar organizations who tried to transform themselves but failed and frankly are no longer with us. Now, the best known of these, going back some time, is Blockbuster, which David will talk about in a lot more detail later. Let me just pick up a couple of others. Borders and most recently Toys R Us failed to transform themselves in response to a fundamental change in retailing, or in particular e-tailing, and are now no longer with us. Air Berlin tried to compete in the low-cost airline business in Europe and failed to succeed in that transformation, and again is no longer with us. And right up to date in the UK, major public sector services organizations like Carillion have recently entered administration and even receivership as a result of failing to transform in response to fundamental changes in their context. So these are organizations who understood that their context was changing, tried to transform themselves in response to that change, but were not successful and are no longer with us. Slide, please, Mary. The second category that we looked at in some detail were organizations which went through some kind of transformation and had emerged as what we would call mere shadows of their former selves. So two particular technology companies, as cases in point, Hewlett-Packard and CSC, have both broken themselves up and spun off separate businesses in order to try to restore some of the value that was present in those companies. In the UK, Royal Bank of Scotland, which at one time was the largest bank in the world, has now retrenched into focusing on the UK market, both retail and business marketplace specifically, in order to recover some of that value. Kodak, which invented, ironically, digital photography, but failed to capitalize on the potential value of that. And David will talk about Nokia as a very insightful example later on. So these are organizations who recognized changes in their context, underwent some significant transformation, and emerged in a very different shape and form from that which they entered into those transformational changes. Slide, please, Mary. And the third category that we put together were very well-known household names, very successful brands who are struggling to regain their once dominant and in some cases global place in the competitive landscape. So we would include people like Rolls-Royce Engines, Tesco, the UK retailer, which was once intent on global domination in supermarket retailing and international expansion, has again retrenched into its core market of the UK with under significant pressure. Anglo-American, which at one time was a mining conglomerate across many mineral commodity sectors, and is now retrenched into a much smaller number of higher value commodity sectors. And we can talk about many of the other examples in the book. And the message here is the jury is still out. Time will tell whether these organizations will indeed be successful in transforming their organizations to shift to a better, improved trajectory for the future. Slide, please, Barry.
Thank you, Peter. Also, during our research, we wanted to get some quantitative data in order to determine whether organizations are getting any better or worse at corporate transformation. Now, we did this by looking at it from a number of perspectives. The first was the churn of companies in the Fortune 500, Standard & Poor's 500, and FTSE 100. And what we found was the average tenure of companies in the S&P 500 has reduced from 33 years in 1965 to just 18 years in 2012 and going down. Also, of the 100 companies in the FTSE 100 when it was formed in 1984, only 30 were present in 2014. And a sobering statistic is that since 2000, over 50% of the Fortune 500 companies have been acquired, merged, or declared bankrupt. The second perspective that we looked at was the success of mergers and acquisitions, which is a form of transformation. And we found that somewhere between 70 and 90% of mergers and acquisitions actually destroy value rather than create value. A classical form of transformation, of course, is to set up a transformation program. And a study in 2012 looked at over 5,400 large, albeit IT projects, but you can't do much transformation nowadays without IT, where each of these budgets, their budgets were over $5 million. And it found that the combined overrun of these projects was in excess of $66 billion, which is more than the GDP of Luxembourg. In another study in 2013, over 2,200 executives claimed that 44% of these didn't understand why the change was being made, which is quite insightful but quite disturbing as well. The fourth lens that we looked through was the tenure of CEOs and other executives. The assumption being that if a transformation is going successful and the company is going successful, why change your CEO? And an analysis by the conference board showed that of the Standard & Poor's 500, the tenure of CEOs declined from 9.9 years in the year 2000 to 8.1 in 2012. And a study by Strategy and showed that the global turnover rose from 12.9% in 2000 to 16.6% in 2015. So all the indications are that the chances are that you will fail in some form of transformation to some degree. So our next question was, what can be done to increase the chances of success? Or to put it another way, what conditions need to be in place? And the first we concluded was that understanding the purpose of transformation is critically important. Another way, why are we doing this transformation? And the conclusion that we came to was that the purpose of the transformation was to change the trajectory of an organization to one that takes it to an improved future. But what do we mean by an improved future? It's entirely dependent upon the organization's situation. It could be better profitability, better cash flow, a more ethical position, greater geographic coverage, or customer loyalty. That's for the organization to decide. But what we believe is the purpose of transformation is to take it or change its trajectory, but will take it to an improved future rather than its default future. And its default future is simply the place the organization will end up if it takes no action other than that currently planned. Slide. The second thing to note, I think, is to understand that a corporate transformation initiative is a response to a change in context, where the context change is a result of the impact of exogenous forces. So what do we mean by exogenous forces? Simply, they're the forces, external forces, on your organization that are changing its context in which it operates. And these forces can be global forces, like population dynamics, globalization, energy uses and availability, climate change, or they can be relatively local forces or regional forces, like regulatory control, trade agreements, and so on. And of course, not forgetting that one of the most important set of exogenous forces are the trajectories of other organizations, some of which you may not have even heard of. It's important to note that exogenous forces change the context over time. To quote Bill Gates, we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10 years. If we don't understand these exogenous forces and how they will shape our context, how can we make informed choices on the type of transformation we should undertake? Slide.
Just talked about those external exogenous forces that create a change in context in which we operate. There's another side to this, and this was something we really wanted to understand in the book, and that was organizations are on their current trajectory for a reason, and we believe that the fundamental reason is the strength and the influence of internal or endogenous forces. Because those endogenous forces, which have often made an organization successful in the past and shouldn't be rubbished, can also act as a brake or an anchor to keep an organization on its current trajectory. And only by understanding the strength and the influence of these endogenous forces can we begin to make a difference in terms of transformation, succeed transformation. And it's a common mistake for CEOs and leaders to significantly underestimate the strength and the influence of these endogenous forces. Slide. So what are these endogenous forces? They originate from within the organization. They're the result of past management decisions and actions. But changing them typically involves significant cost and time and effort. Some of them are visible and easily observable: organization structure, leadership and management style, the IT landscape. But some of them are much more difficult to see, are hidden to the untrained eye, what is sometimes called culture, the values and beliefs and mindsets of the organization, past winning strategies. And the conclusion we came to in looking at both exogenous and endogenous forces was that if corporate transformation is to succeed, then its goal has to be to significantly change the strength and the influence of these endogenous forces. Slide, please. One of the most powerful endogenous forces that we believe act as an anchor to an organization staying on its current trajectory are ironically the organizational capabilities that have been developed over time and have actually made the organization successful. David will talk about Blockbuster, and that's a very good example of this. And we shouldn't underestimate both the value and the strength and influence of these. They act like the muscles that are exercised in the organization to enable the organization to do specific things well. But they also become organizational habits. And whilst that's all well and good, until a context changes, they can anchor an organization to its current trajectory. And thirdly, if we are to succeed with any kind of corporate transformation, it is axiomatic, it is highly likely that new organizational capabilities will be needed. Existing ones may need to be strengthened, and existing ones may need to be weakened or even let go of in order for the organization to shift to its future trajectory. Slide.
Thank you, Peter. So let's look at a couple of examples where, first of all, the shifting context that resulted from a change of the exogenous forces opened up strategic opportunities, and then further changes to these exogenous forces closed them down. And secondly, how these endogenous forces that were developed during the period of success anchored the organization to its current trajectory and made it very difficult, in fact, in these two examples, impossible to transform. So the first example is Blockbuster. And I'm sure that those of you over a certain age will remember going down to the Blockbuster store and selecting videos to watch at home. But what made Blockbuster so successful so quickly? Well, its founder, David Cook, recognized how changing exogenous forces were creating what we call a trajectory of strategic opportunity. And these forces were, first of all, advances in video recording technology and the establishment of the VHS format, which resulted in the price of VHS video players dropping significantly. The second was that film studios made their movies available for rental months before they were available for sale. Thirdly, advances in database technology enabled Blockbuster to manage stock much more effectively and to customize stores to specific demographic profiles. And perhaps fourthly, people wanted to watch movies at the time of their own choosing. Now, this created an opportunity for phenomenal growth for Blockbuster. And in responding to this, Blockbuster developed a set of capabilities, a set of organizational capabilities the capability to locate and open stores, the capability to set up and manage franchise agreements, the capability to stock their stores to the demographic profiles of their customers. Now, at its peak, Blockbuster was opening a store every 17 hours. It was so successful that in 1994, it was acquired by Viacom for $8.4 billion. But, and there's always a but, around 1999, the year 2000, their context started to shift, started to change, and that was a result of the exogenous navigating force that we call broadband, which enabled the streaming of movies to computers and later tablets and smart TVs. Now, Blockbuster was not able to respond quickly to this change of context because the organizational capabilities it had developed anchored it to its existing store-based trajectory. It did not have the capabilities needed to stream movies over broadband like Apple and later Netflix had. As a result, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2010 and closed its remaining stores in 2013. Slide, please. The second example is Nokia. And I'm sure all of you have had a Nokia phone at some time. Now, Nokia actually follows a very similar trajectory to Blockbuster, in that it was tremendously successful as a result of a context created by a set of exogenous forces, and then became unsuccessful because of a change of the influence of different exogenous forces. And the first of those that made it very successful is that 75% of Finland is dense forest. It has over 180,000 lakes and a similar number of small islands, which makes traditional landline communication very expensive. Now, actually, this exogenous navigating force has not changed for some while. The second change was that the Finnish government announced in 1968 to build a national mobile communications network. And furthermore, in 1981, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark announced the development of the most advanced mobile telecom system in the world. And fourthly, in the early 90s, Nokia was very active in the global system for multimedia mobile communication, known as GSM. This created a context for Nokia to apply the capabilities it had got around switching technology, which resulted in it launching the first fully mobile, portable mobile phone in 1987. And what's more, it also recognized, unlike its competitors like Ericsson, that the mobile phone would become a true consumer device, where its competitors concentrated on military communication or mobile phones in cars. This put it on a trajectory of tremendous growth. And in the mid-90s, it was selling 300,000 units a day. And during this period, it developed the capability to manufacture in large scale and produce numerous models. However, around the year 2000, the context shift started to change with the advent of broadband, and Nokia failed to recognize the significance of this context shift. And this context shift was a result of the mobile internet, enabled by digital as opposed to analog technology, and also that the mobile phone was becoming a terminal connected to the internet. The significant point is the capabilities that it had developed during the 90s were anchoring it to its existing trajectory, preventing it from shifting its trajectory to one that was based upon the mobile internet, software platforms, operating systems, and value-based ecosystems. It's also important to note that most of Nokia, in fact all of Nokia phones during this period of time, all the functionality was in the electronics that was in the phone rather than in the software. And it was during this shift in the early 2000s where the functionality shifted to that was provided by the software in the software operating platform. In an attempt to be more innovative, it introduced the matrix structure in 2003, which only slowed down all the decision making. Now, in 2013, it sold its mobile devices division to Microsoft, who in turn, in 2016, sold it to HMD Global. The Nokia phone still lives on though, and today, with the Android-based Nokia 3, Nokia 5 and Nokia 6, and also the reimagined classic Nokia 3310. Now, in both of these examples, the changing exogenous forces created a strategic opportunity. But further changes to those exogenous forces closed those strategic opportunities down again. It changed the context. And furthermore, the capabilities of the companies developed during their growth acted as endogenous forces, anchoring them to their current trajectory. Slide, please.
Thanks, David. So let's broaden the scope of this. So David's talked about two historical and quite similar examples of organizations which needed to transform themselves in response to a change in context, largely driven by exogenous forces. Now, I'm sure many of you on this webinar will be within organizations who have one or more digital transformation initiatives or programs underway. So to bring this right up to date, let's talk about some of the drivers, some of the changes being driven by exogenous forces. We talk about the internet, the ubiquity of smartphones and mobile apps on mobile devices, big data and data analytics, millennials, and we should add to this, as Don Tapscott, with blockchain. All of those exogenous forces are driving a change in context, which we see being evidenced right now in every sector, from finance to automotive to agri-tech to healthcare and telemedicine to entertainment. So it's imperative for all organizations to understand that change in context, to understand, as David said, the trajectory of strategic opportunity, and figure out how it's going to compete in the future, because non-traditional new startups, non-traditional organizations can come and compete in that space. But we also need to recognize, as we said earlier, that there are these anchoring endogenous forces within the organization that can keep us on our current trajectory and constrain us from moving to a different trajectory for the future. And these include, especially in financial services, the legacy IT landscape, the way we develop software solutions, the way we govern IT, the relationship between business and IT, which is still, after 3 decades, very much of an order-taker relationship, and the sheer mindset that exists. And if we're to succeed in digital transformation initiatives, then we have to focus on some of those pulling endogenous forces which will pull us onto our future trajectory and represent a significant shift in some of those capabilities. So being able to create a coherent digital customer experience, being able to be agile in the development of software solutions and DevOps, being more of a partner with the business in discovering solutions and potential benefit rather than defining the requirements, and having this complete digital mindset rather than the old mindset of we know what's best for the customer. So it is axiomatic that we will have to put in place new, different, pulling organizational capabilities, endogenous forces to shift us onto a trajectory to make us successful in the future. Slide, please.
So before we open it up for questions, let's review what we've discussed so far. In fact, what we'd like to do is to offer you 5 takeaways. The first one is to understand and acknowledge that the purpose of any corporate transformation is to change the trajectory of the organization from one that's taking it to its default future to an improved future. It's all about changing the trajectory of the organization. And corporate transformation is a response. You're doing it for a reason. It's something that's triggered this initiative, this transformation. And we argue that's because of a change of context. Some contexts change quickly, some contexts change more slowly. But the context changes as a result of the influence of the changing exogenous external forces. Thirdly, organizations are on a given trajectory for a reason. And that reason is the influence of the internal, the endogenous forces, many of which have made the organization successful in the past. And endogenous forces originate within your organization. So if you're involved in a corporate transformation initiative, the only thing you can do is to change the influence of the endogenous forces. You cannot change the exogenous forces because they are external. So unless you understand what those endogenous forces are and the influence they play on your trajectory, then how can you make informed choices as to how to change the influence of those forces? And probably one of the most powerful and important endogenous forces are the capabilities that you've built up over time. As Peter said, the muscles that the organization has developed that become habits, and as a result can anchor you to your to your current trajectory. So, in summary then, for a corporate transformation to be successful, we believe that 2 things need to be seriously considered. Firstly, new or strengthened organizational capabilities are required in order to pull the organization onto its target trajectory. Secondly, existing organizational capabilities need to be weakened or even eliminated so they stop anchoring the organization to its current trajectory. Over to you, Marion.
All right. Thank you so much, David and Peter. We'll now have about 10 minutes to answer any typed questions from the audience. So any questions that you have for David or Peter, feel free to type those into the chat box on your screen. I will then read your question aloud, and then David or Peter will do their very best to answer your question. So we'll give everyone a couple of seconds to formulate their thoughts, type in their questions in the chat box. While we're waiting, I actually have one question myself, if you don't mind. So my question is, if you're leading a corporate transformation, what would you say, what's the one thing you should focus on to increase the chances of success?
Peter, would you like to take that?
Let me begin, and you can respond, David. I think, David and I have worked with many leaders in many organizations in many different sectors, and I think the essence of this is really, I think we take it for granted that good leaders and good strategies will take account of the exogenous forces which are driving and changing the context in which a business and industry sector operates. I think that's just a given. The degree to which it's done well, we can argue about, but let's just take that as a given. I think the essence of the role of leaders in being successful at corporate transformation is, as David said at the end there, to really understand the strength and the influence of those endogenous forces that are anchoring an organization to its current trajectory. Now, this is both politically and emotionally very, very difficult because It's those very endogenous forces and organizational capabilities which has made that organization successful in the past, and it is very, very difficult to weaken, to eliminate, to strengthen, and to bring in new organizational capabilities to successfully shift an organization to a trajectory for the future, which is where it will compete and grow and sustain itself for the future. And I think leaders, I think the bottom line here is leaders underestimate the strength and the influence of those endogenous forces. David?
Well, the only thing I would add, Peter, I agree with all that. I think the only other thing I would add is I'll probably add a mantra, and the mantra is it's all about changing trajectory. So are we making the right choices? Are we doing the right things that are going to change trajectory? Or are we doing stuff because a book on corporate transformation tells us we need to do these things?
All right, fantastic, thank you. And this is very similar to my question, but just curious if you have anything to add here. Participant Frank Kapek asks, would love to hear more about the how. What are the key elements behind success?
That's a good question, Frank. I think that the how very much focuses on how do we make the informed choices that will create a change in trajectory. So we need to assess, we need to understand what these exogenous forces are, so we understand the context that's going to be created in the future. Don't just transform based upon what is in place today. You have to understand what the future might be like, and you can. The future is out there. It's just not evenly distributed. So if you understand those exogenous forces, you can pretty well predict what your industry and what your context might be like in years to come. And then you have to assess. You have to assess the degree to which these endogenous forces are anchoring you to your present. So unless you know that, then you can't make informed choices in terms of what you need to do to change their influence. So I think the how, Frank, is very much getting down to understanding the influence of the exogenous forces and the context that it will create. And it's also around understanding the influence of the endogenous forces and making informed choices as to what interventions, what actions you can take. And it will differ. It's completely contextual on the organisation, and make informed choices in terms of what needs to be put in place, what needs to be done to change the trajectory. I come back to my mantra. It's all about changing trajectory. And if you don't recognise you're on a trajectory, you'll never make the right choices. I hope that answers your question, Frank.
All right, and next question comes from Mark Zawacki, who asks, all organizations are buzzword compliant. How do you get beyond the noise and get organizations to actually do something meaningful?
It's a very good question, Mark. Let me make probably a provocative statement, but I think, David, we devote a chapter to this in the book. Mark, we see an absence of collective leadership. We see the prevalence of strong individual heroic leadership in a lot of organizations and a lot of sectors. And we see an absence of collective leadership, which David and I would argue, without collective leadership, there will be no collective strategy. And most strategies in most multi-business unit organizations are no more than the sum of the individual business unit or division strategies. And that's not sufficient. We need to go beyond that. So one of our mantras is build that collective leadership capability around the things that David has said. I think the second thing I would say, and David, you can add to this, you can mentally model the future in almost every industry sector using simulations, using scenario-based theory, whatever it is you want to do. And I think, Mark, also the other dynamic here is that we live in this volatile, uncertain, constantly changing, chaotic, and ambiguous world. The pace of change is getting faster. So I think it's incumbent upon leaders to develop those capabilities to sense and respond, as we've been saying for many decades, but at a much faster pace than has been the case in the past. And then to commit to some action, to, if you like, fail fast and learn from that, to not be afraid to experiment and try because you don't know what you don't know. David, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, first of all, I think I'd like to thank Mark for perhaps suggesting the title of our next book called Beyond the Noise. So rather than going beyond default, let's go beyond the noise. More seriously, though, I think that one of the reasons why organizations don't take any corporate transformation seriously is they don't believe in it, and they don't confront the default future. There's a lot of lip service, as I'm sure you know, Mark, and what amuses me, if I'm on a train journey, and you can do this on trains, you can't do it on planes anymore, is to sort of look over at someone's laptop or look over at the papers they've got on the table. And it's all about, there's a transformation program. Everybody's got some form of transformation program. Like every initiative is a transformation program. But is it really a transformation program, or is it just an incremental improvement program? You know, what are they fundamentally trying to achieve? Have they really confronted their default future? Because if they had, it would be a transformation program. Now, I don't take on board what Peter says. Absolutely, unless there's collective leadership, then all the individual leaders will be pulling the organization in different ways. So you won't have a coherent transformation. You'll have many, many, many different transformations, each competing for the same resource and pulling the organization in different ways. So I hope it helps, Mark.
And David and Marion, to that point, I think Karen's question is to that point, David. How do you do this in a multi-business unit, multi-divisional, multinational organization where some of those endogenous forces are actually determined by corporate or the parent company? This is very hard to do. And our view on that, Karen, is that at the enterprise level, at the group level, or whatever you want to call it, it's incumbent upon the leaders to put the future trajectory of the enterprise first, and the success, and in some cases even the survival of individual business units second. Now, I know the jury's still out on this, but just look at what's been happening at GE, firstly under Jeff Immelt, and exiting financial services, and now under John Flannery, exiting some major businesses. Those are tough choices, and tough decisions have to be made there. I'm not trivializing that at all. David and I have worked in many multinational, multi-business unit environments. It's tough.
Marion, I hope you don't mind, but I'm just reading the question from Nick Bush. And my short answer to the question, Nick, it's about, you've got to find a way of these executives experiencing the future.
And David, could you just read the question? I'm sorry, could you just read Nick's question just so that everyone knows what the question is? And the answer?
Trajectory is a powerful idea, but ultimately you'll be painting a picture of where the organization will end up, and senior executives may still be in denial on the influence of the endogenous forces, and they therefore disagree with the picture you paint. How can you overcome this basic resistance? In some of the most successful transformation programs that Peter and I have been involved in, it involves an experiential learning journey where we took executives out of the village, out of their organization, and got them to experience the future. So they really got it. They felt it rather than trying to get it over to them by PowerPoint. So my short answer to the question, and I realise we're running out of time, you've got to find ways of them experiencing the future, so they say, I don't want my organization to be in that future. I've got to take some personal accountability for changing our trajectory.
All right, thank you. And our last question here comes from Frank Kapek again. He says, trajectory paints the forward from the present/past picture. He asks, is there a complementary concept that shows the gap backward from the future?
Okay, Frank, that's a very important question. Thanks for clarifying this. I don't want anybody to be under the assumption that when we're talking about going beyond default, we start from the present and go to the future. We do this in two parts. First of all, you do start from the present when you start to ask your question, what is our default future? If you want, you do a fast forward in terms of what that future might be. What you then need to do once you've confronted that default future is to ask the question, what is the future we want? And what is the future that is possible based upon the influence of the exogenous forces and also the influence of the endogenous forces. So if you like, it's a two-pass. First one, confront your default future by doing a left to right. And then when you start to define your target future, i.e. the trajectory you want to get on, then it's if you like, a right to left, to use some consulting jargon. Oh, that's clear, Frank.
All right, sounds good. That is all the time for our questions today. And P.S. Mark Zawecki says, invoice is in the post for the next book title. So thank you for that, Mark. And it's now time to choose our one lucky winner who will receive a free hard copy of their book Beyond Default. So at random, today's winner is, drum roll please, Karen Cook. So congratulations, Karen. I will be emailing you after the webinar with shipping details. Congrats once again. All right, that is our time for today. Thanks again to all for joining us. If you have any lingering questions at all, feel free to email David or Peter directly at these email addresses listed here, or of course you can connect via Twitter. Once again, we'll be emailing a link to the recording of this webinar to all registrants within the next 24 hours, so definitely keep an eye out for that email in your inbox. And of course, don't forget to order your copy of Beyond Default, Setting Your Organization on a Trajectory to an Improved Future. It is available on Amazon. All right, thank you so much everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful day. Take care.